So I have the privilege of introducing my dear friends, and didn't have a lot of time to think about how to introduce them. I would have written you like a spoken word and like the whole thing. Would have put in Chat GPT first. But if you know Doctors Emily and Essence, they are a gift to this community. And I have to say that when they came back to Sarasota, because Emily is originally from Sarasota, I think they were just stopping by. They were just stopping through for a little bit to figure out what was their next chapter in life and where the journey would take them. And we're lucky enough that they have decided to stay in Sarasota. And their gift and what they do for parents who are journeying and finding out that they have a queer child, for people who are themselves are suffering with any type of mental illness, or they themselves are figuring out that they are queer and maybe have religious trauma. The BIPOC communities, I know that Essence really focuses on the BIPOC community. And so if you have I would encourage you, if you have a business, a nonprofit, a group of people who need to hear these subjects from professionals, I highly recommend, and you'll see it, they'll prove it themselves this morning. They have such passion for people. They are incredibly just intuitive. They just can read the room and really have a passion to hear people's journey and be a guide and a love to them. So we are honored and blessed to know them and for them to be a part of our family. So will you please welcome Doctors Emily and Essence. And they are to be wed the end of this month. Executive functioning.
Hi.
Hey.
So if you don't know us, I'm Emily.
I'm Essence.
And about, I think like 2 weeks ago, we had a meeting with Dan and KK, and we were like, it's really been on our hearts that we might not be able to financially give back to the church in the way we want to right now, but we have gifts that we can share. And so we said, hey, we work in mental health, we're both psychologists. Can we meet with you guys and start spreading information about mental health and protecting your own safety and how to create cultures of safety? And they said, perfect, we have an opening in 2 weeks.
We said, let's go.
And so here we are. And the ultimate goal of this is we know how difficult it can be to access mental health, how stigmatizing it can be. And so the goal is to make this just a conversation. We were trained a lot in talking to the community, and the first lesson we got is don't tell people stuff, talk to them about stuff. And so the goal of this is to give you as much information as we can, but also leave some space to have some time to talk and ask you questions and see if we can give you answers, and at least leave this Sunday with more information than maybe you had at the beginning. And the ultimate goal is to have you start asking more questions than for us to give you answers. And so if you leave with a lot of questions, I know Dan preaches the same thing, then we're doing a good job.
Yeah, I also want to say thank you to everybody that's checked on my mouth. We went on our bachelorette trip last weekend, and I did use Sunbum, but not enough. So Emily is not hurting me. I just got a sunburn. So figured we should say that just in case.
It's a good disclaimer.
People are like, what happened to her? Okay, so if you didn't know, Tuesday, September 10th, this is every year, September 10th, is World Suicide Prevention Day. And so we thought that this was nicely timed because this will really set you up to kind of apply these skills this week. But we want to focus on kind of the church's role, and the church not as like a place, but the church as each of us, and what is our job in helping to prevent something like suicide. In the Bible, we see Jesus talk about like raising people from the dead, and we notice that when people die by suicide, a lot of times people are like, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened. How did we get here?" And I think it's because a lot of times we respond to suicide after it's too late, and we may not be going around being able to like bring people back to life after their body has died, but we also don't have to wait until then to give life back. And so that's kind of where our hearts are this morning. So there are some studies out there that talk about the role of like being involved in a religious community on suicide specifically. And there's a lot of people that will talk about this because what we found is that higher religious commitment is associated with lower suicide attempts. So what people will do is they'll say, okay, all those people that go to church are just better and have happier lives, and people that don't go to church are depressed, and that's why they kill themselves more. And we would just like to say, like, that is not an accurate interpretation of that statistic, and like to kind of guide our interpretations there. So I was digging. I was like, I don't accept that. Like, tell me in the research, like, how does this happen? And what I found is that this statistic is true in cultures that have everybody practices like the same religion, or everybody is a part of the same culture. So if you match the group that you are belonging to, then yeah, it's protective. However, when there are situations where you don't fit in with your religious or faith organization, or you are just discriminated against in some way, form, or fashion, there are actually higher rates of suicide, especially if you feel isolated. And so when we see that statistic, we have to remember that that is true as long as you belong. And if you don't belong, then we're at higher risk. And unfortunately, most of us do know somebody that has died by suicide. And so it's common. And it might become even more common as our world continues to world.
On average, a suicide occurs every 11 minutes in the United States. So if we're in church from 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m., 9 people have died by suicide on average in the time that we're sitting here. 11 minutes is not a lot of time. That's one person every 11 minutes.
And that's just the U.S.
It's just
like
the US.
Globally, we're seeing like 1,925 a day around the world. But in the U.S., it's just the 127 in every 11 minutes.
In Florida, suicide is the 12th leading cause of death, just in the state of Florida. And what we know about identities is when we start adding marginalized identities, we see risk go higher. And so if we're looking just at the total population, we're seeing that yearly, over 700,000 people die by suicide. If we look at LGBTQ plus teens, their risk of suicide is 4 times higher compared to their heterosexual peers. Just one identity. You add one identity and the risk goes by 4 times. Research also shows that 40% of trans adults have attempted suicide at some point in their lifetime. That's nearly 9 times the rate of the general US population. It's staggering when we start to add identities, things that people don't choose. It is just who they are, and just by existing, these rates increase. But it's not just sexual minorities or gender minorities. For individuals on the autism spectrum, they're 9 times more likely to die by suicide. And individuals with ADHD are 3 times as likely to attempt suicide compared to their neurotypical peers. Racial and ethnic minorities, we know that for people who have immigrated to different countries, risk of social isolation, a lack of access to community, and language barriers also increase their risk of suicide. It doesn't mean anytime that we talk about risk factors that these are set in stone. It doesn't mean, it's blinking red. Mic switch out. So it doesn't mean that it's set in stone, right? It doesn't mean just because you're an LGBTQ plus minority or you've immigrated that you are going to attempt suicide at some point. But these risk factors mean that you are more likely, if stress occurs, that you might be have less resources to be able to deal with these things. We also know that poverty, socioeconomic factors come into play as well. If you're unemployed, if you're struggling to make ends meet and be able to pay your rent and pay your utilities and pay for childcare, and all these things come into play. If your housing is at risk, we know that these also increase the risk factors related to suicide. And we're going to talk really in depth about some of these risk factors, what to pay attention to. But it's really important to know that when we're talking about people who are going to be impacted, that we need to be mindful that everyone is at risk to attempt suicide. But some individuals have increased risk just because of who they are.
So, suicide is not something that just happens because people don't have their life together, or because they don't go to church, or because they don't make good choices, or whatever. There is a big myth that people who have their lives together are not at risk. Like, oh, they look great, they have everything going on. And so we looked at a bunch of studies about suicide notes. And there were 6 factors that tend to come up over and over and over again when people write notes. So the first one is alienation. We see this especially with like veteran populations, that after like going to war and coming back, feeling like, what is my place in the world, and like, what is my purpose? What am I even doing here? And it can create a lot of like hopelessness around like who you're connected to, because it's such a unique experience. This happens a lot too with minorities who feel kind of trapped at times between the society or the structures of life that they live in and who they are as people. And this is really true in the church. I know, like, growing up in my family, there were churches that my family was the only people of color in the entire church. And that's lonely. And when events happen in the world and you're bothered or you're struggling and the people around you are not, that can feel super like confusing. We also know that people that are worried about like expressing themselves or talking about their challenges or their struggles, a lot of times that's because there's a fear of being ostracized or being pushed aside even further than they might already feel. And so that can lead people to attempt suicide because they're not really sure what else to do or how to make that disconnect from other people end.
Yeah, and hopelessness comes up a lot. It is the most cited reason for suicide in suicide notes. It is the belief that things aren't going to get better, the belief that nothing is going to change, that there's nothing that you can do to help your situation, that anybody else can do to help you. And that is a feeling of just despair, and it kind of feels like you're stuck. Like, I've heard people describe it as feeling like you're stuck in quicksand. The more you try and fight, the deeper it pulls you in. And so people who are suffering from depression and anxiety, oftentimes the messaging, as we were reflecting on this, is that people get from the church is that if you do what you need to do and you'll pray, then God will take care of it. But if it doesn't get better, then you're told that you did something wrong. And how hopeless does that feel? That if something good's gonna happen, it's up to a figure who is like up in the sky, who is just doing what he needs to do, and you don't get better, it's on you. And that is an incredibly hopeless feeling, to feel like it's up to the universe for you to feel better. And if you don't, good luck, you'll figure it out. And when you feel hopeless and you feel stuck, then we talk about pain. Emotional pain, physical pain. And most of the time, people also cite that they're using suicide to escape the pain, to not have to feel it anymore, to not feel stuck, to not feel like a burden, to be able to just be done with it. And we know that this gets cited in about 50% of people who commit suicide and who leave a note or a reason, is that it was just easier to be done.
We also see that a lot of people talk about experiencing guilt and shame. This really comes from this sense of like perceived failure, feeling like, I was supposed to do something, or I was supposed to be this and I'm not. And a lot of times we'll go to church and seek comfort in that like discrepancy, and church can either be a safe place to land, like we've talked about a lot, or it can be a place that reinforces those negative beliefs you already have about yourself, which is like, yeah, you're not measuring up. Yeah, you are less than. And that's not what we're here to do. We also see that some other like reasons that people might attempt suicide are having struggles in their relationships or trying to just gain control in their life. And so there are a lot of ways that marginalized groups might struggle with these 6 things, but there's also ways that majority groups will struggle with these 6 things. These aren't unique to being marginalized. However, the stressors that marginalized people do face make them more vulnerable to suicide because of the stress that they're already under.
So the way that stress is talked about in communities is that stress is cumulative. It gains interest. It doesn't stack next to each other. It stacks on top of each other.
So we are going to do kind of a demonstration. We need 2 volunteers. Okay.
Sibling competition.
Amazing. It's more of an illustration, but you guys can take it how you would like. Okay, so you guys can come up here. And while Emily's getting things ready, the question is, do you know how to stand on one foot? Like, are you able to do that? Okay, show us. Okay, each of you can stand on one foot. We love it. And so we will, not my aquaphor. So, in life, God sees us as the same, right? We show up and we're people, and we are treated as equally in the eyes of God. However, society doesn't always see it that way, and they present us with different, or we have different kind of strengths, weaknesses, structures, supports, that kind of thing in our lives. So, as we can see, Aaron has kind of the traditional shopping bag, and Dan has a more reinforced from our Disney trip this weekend bag. And if we think Aaron's gonna represent a individual who is a single parent, is trying to go to church, trying to parent, but facing a bunch of stressors. And so let's say that, and Dan is facing, an individual that doesn't have as many stressors, has a big supportive family, who is a white, cisgender, heterosexual individual, right? And so, so when we look, they're both people and they both have bags, but Dan's looks a little bit different than Aaron's does. So let's say that life is happening and all of a sudden a family member gets sick. Where Aaron may experience where she has to take off of work, or she has to kind of figure out a way to take care of this family member. Dan might have that supportive family that can kind of fill in the gaps and not cause him to be unable to do what he needs to do.
It's also important that not only is Aaron's bag less sturdy, Aaron started with more cans. She started with a lot more. And I very carefully put the can into Dan's. I was throwing it into Aaron's. And so not only did a stressor happen to both of them, but someone was already carrying more cans than someone else.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now we want you guys to stand on one foot. Yeah, and so they both showed at the beginning that they are capable of handling what life threw at them. But when something like a past due bill comes, it adds more weight to Erin. And she's still doing it, but she's wobbly a little bit. And then let's say that she can't go and connect with her support system because they have the family member and different things going on. So that's another kind of stressor. And so we can see that both of them are carrying it, right? But who do we think is putting in a little bit more work or having to put in more work in order to carry what life has handed them? Aaron, right? And Aaron, how do you think that carrying this weight is impacting your ability to stand up?
It would eventually weigh on me. Right now I feel good, but probably in 10 minutes I would not.
And how are you doing?
I feel great. Other than a little chubby, I feel great.
Okay, so this is really kind of when we all come together, we're all carrying different kind of bags. We're all trying to go through and stand on one foot and do our best through life. And we can't always tell what people have going on. We also...
You can put your foot down.
Oh yeah, you can put your foot down, right? So if Erin puts her foot down and says like, this is too much, right? I can't do this anymore, my hip's hurting. We may look and be like, well, you both had bags. What do you mean you can't do it? Look at Dan, he's fine. Why can't you do it? And that's a really good representation of like the mental and the physical load that people are carrying around, where it's not ever really apples to apples. We're often looking at people in very different circumstances with very different supports and expecting them to have the exact same behavior. And that's not how it works. So thank you to our volunteers.
Great illustration.
So, we can't always tell how many cans people have in their bags. We can't always tell what they're carrying. But we could start to tell when people are struggling a little bit, right? Erin was kind of like a little wobbly, kind of like looking at us like, are you gonna do something? Can I stop? And a lot of times, the very first thing that we can do when we're trying to figure out how to help people that are struggling with suicidality or just struggling with their lives, we have to be able to notice that that is a thing that they are struggling with. So before any, like what you should say or what you should do, let's talk about how you know that there's something up.
Yeah, it's so important that you can't decide what bag you get or what bag someone else gets. But you have to be able to see the difference. And if we can see the difference, that's the very first start of it. And sometimes seeing the difference is noticing warning signs. And so being able to pay attention, to notice differences, to notice changes becomes really important. Not everyone's a therapist, not everyone is trained. I mean, we had classes where they sat down and were like, okay, these are the things you pay attention to. This is what you look for. These are small changes, but not everyone has that training. And so it's really important that you have like acronyms that can help you start to figure out, what do I need to pay attention to? So the acronym that is the most helpful is FACTS. And so these are the things you want to pay attention to if things start to change for someone that you maybe are concerned about. The first part is feelings. So expressions of feeling overwhelmed, sad. You see someone who is constantly feeling down. We also want to look for changes in emotion too. So if you have someone who is expressed for a very long time feeling hopeless or helpless or feeling sad or depressed, and there's a sudden change and they start to feel relieved, that's a big warning sign for a lot of people, is why is there a sudden change in their emotion? We also want to pay attention to actions. So are they engaging in more risky behaviors? Are they using substances, drinking alcohol more than they normally would? Are we noticing that they're being a bit more reckless with the choices that they're making? Sometimes suicide doesn't always look like a more active thing. It can be more passive. It can be, I'm not going to buckle my seatbelt when I get in the car. Or, you know, I'm going to take these pills, but I'm just going to make sure that I take one more than the prescribed dose. Things like that. Also withdrawing from activities. Sometimes it is not the presence of a behavior, but the absence of a behavior that we want to look for. Were they a person that went out and had dinner with their friends and now they're not? Did they go to like kickball every week, but now they're not showing up to games? We want to pay attention to things like that. Changes in behavior, agitation, irritability, if they're changing their sleeping habits. Are they a person who got like a solid 8 hours every day, now they're not sleeping at all, or they're sleeping the entire day away? Are they eating more or less than they normally would? Those are changes that we definitely want to pay attention to, as well as a decline in personal hygiene. Are they showering? Are they shaving? Are they doing the things that would just help them feel a little bit better, a little more routine? We also want to pay attention to threats. So are they making very blatant, clear threats, talking about death more, talking about, you know, I'm looked up in this thing and could this kill me? What could this be like? It also can be jokes. They might be joking about death. They might be joking a little bit more about not being around or some changes that have been going on. If they're making plans or researching ways to die, we want to pay attention to those things. Does it mean that you need to be going through people's internet histories? Like, no, be respectful of privacy.
Yeah.
But if they're talking about this stuff to you or they're showing you things, just be aware. If you can be aware, you're going to catch some stuff that maybe if you weren't looking for it. And the last is situations. So have there been major changes going on in their life recently? Losses of a loved one? Did they lose their job? Has a relationship ended? Are they in trouble with the law or school of some kind? We also want to make sure that while we're not trying to take away their autonomy, that we are paying attention. We don't want to infer, we don't want to make assumptions about their ability to cope, but we just pay attention a little bit more and we notice a friend who might be going through something bigger than we might recognize. The biggest thing that comes up a lot is I either don't know what to look for, or I do know what to look for, but I have no idea what to do once I start to recognize that something's going on.
So there's so many people that are like, I don't want to do this because it's going to turn out like that, or I don't want to do this because then it may make them do this. There's a lot of worry around like the wrong responses. So we will tell you some of the wrong responses so that you know what things might be associated with like increased suicidal ideation or attempts or things like that. And then we will also tell you what to do. So one of the biggest myths that I think people hear or believe is that asking somebody about suicide will make them commit suicide. There is no research, no evidence to support that that is true. Asking somebody directly about that topic or even having a conversation will not increase the chances that they actually do it. In fact, it will likely decrease because then they let somebody in and they can talk about it. So one of the worst things that we can do is just avoiding it. So we see that something's up and we're like, I'm not gonna talk to them. Or they're like, I'm really struggling. And you're like, oh, well, did you see the game last night? Like trying to change the subject. A lot of times this makes ourselves feel like, a little bit better because we don't wanna feel that discomfort, but ignoring it communicates to somebody that like nobody notices or nobody cares.
We also want to try and avoid fixing or saving the person. They're not coming to you because they want you to talk them out of it or they want you to like be the one person in their support system that can stop them. They're coming to you because they want you to understand, empathize, and meet them where they're at. So responses like, oh, you're cutting yourself, you should probably stop that, it's not very good for you. Like that's not the response that is needed at that point in time. That creates a lot of shame and often can make it so the person won't come talk to you again. We also want to avoid making it about ourselves. When someone comes up and says, hey, I'm thinking about hurting myself or I'm thinking about killing myself, that's very uncomfortable on the receiving end. As a therapist, it can still be uncomfortable to hear. And it's normal for it to create uncomfortable emotions. But one way to deal with your emotions is not to make it about your experience. That person is coming to you because they need your help, they need your support, not because they wanted to hear about you or the one time that you thought about it. While it's important to be able to relate to someone, we want to make sure that we don't turn that conversation around on us and say, this is really hard for me, I'm really worried about you. We want to make sure that the focus stays on that person needing support.
Another area where we sometimes can mess up is we try to create some type of meaning out of what people are experiencing. We're like, oh, this must be because of your family problems, or just really trying to find a reason. I don't think that there is a reason that we could say yeah, that's a good reason to just be gone. I totally support them wanting to end their lives, right? And so it's not really a good use of our time trying to investigate, explain, analyze, do any of those things. They don't need you to explain what they're feeling to them. We also don't want, I think a big reason why people don't talk about when they're struggling is the fear of pity. And people being like, oh, you poor thing, I can't believe that it's gotten that bad, or I don't even know what I would do if I was in your position. That feeling of pity is so alienating. And so even though you might be feeling that or thinking that in your head, wow, I can't believe they're going through that, that is not the response that we want to communicate in those moments where people are really struggling.
We also want to avoid being overly positive. Another way to kind of deal with the uncomfortable emotions is to try and find the silver lining. That's not the time to tell people that they really have it better than they realize, right? Or think of all the positives. I'm sure they've tried to find the positives, and they're still here. And so part of that reason is saying, okay, being realistic, being honest with them, but also making sure that we're not trying to kind of lay it on too thick and be like, well, at least you still have this, and think of all the things that are going right in your life. There is a time for that, but when someone initially talks to you about that, that's not the time. We also want to avoid same kind of like centering yourself as saying, I know just how you feel. While we all are at risk for attempting suicide, everyone's experience is so individual that you don't know how they got there. You don't know what they're feeling, what they're thinking. That's on them to be able to communicate that to you. And while it's important to be able to like empathize, we want to make sure that we're not saying, well, your experience, I know exactly how you feel. We don't, so we want to make sure we give them space to be able to talk about it. The last important thing is making sure that we're not making decisions on someone else's behalf. When it comes to hopelessness and helplessness, taking away someone's autonomy contributes to that. If you're like, okay, well, you told me this, we're going to the hospital, we didn't even have a conversation, or even someone saying like, I'm scared of, cutting myself, and then unilaterally deciding to take all the knives out of their home without even talking to them, gives them a space to feel powerless in their own care. And so we want to be really mindful that we give options, we give choices, and we include people in conversations. So saying, okay, well, do you want to go get food or go take a shower? A simple two-choice statement like that gives someone the power back to make a choice on what they want to do. Asking questions, well, what do you think would help you feel safe? That opens up the conversation to say, okay, what do you think I could help you do to make you feel safe? It's not our job to say this is what you need, but it is our job to make sure that we're encouraging people to have conversations about what they need.
And if you're not a therapist or a teacher or something like that, you may have never had somebody just like up and tell you that they're like thinking about ending their lives. It's not always communicated in that way. However, with the community that we are creating here at Harvest and with the connections that a lot of us are making, we're increasing the risk of this happening. It is more likely that when you're doing life with people that this could happen to you. And so we want to talk about and just kind of acknowledge that. So when churches are unsafe, right? When you're in an environment where you can't be yourself or you can't have emotions or you can't react, the likelihood that you're going to talk about it, slim to none, because you're going to be like, I'm going to keep it together. I'm going to put on my cute little outfit and pretend like I have my life together. But when we're in churches where we feel safe, where we feel valued, where we feel seen, we're more likely to open up. And in order to have a community that facilitates conversations about this topic, we have to be willing to go there and talk about hard things. And I think the leadership here is modeling the willingness to go there. And so it's likely that many of us will start to have conversations about people struggling that maybe we hadn't been exposed to before.
Yeah. So the first step is education and awareness. Like by all of you being here today, step one. We're good. So, and that's saying I'm willing to learn, I'm willing to ask questions, I'm willing to sit in some uncomfortable topics and be able to say I want to learn more, recognize the stigma, the impact, and a way to move forward. Building relationships, making sure that you have the ability to like check in on people, have phone numbers. It's more than just saying like, hi, how are you once every Sunday. It's making sure that if someone doesn't show up, we might check in on them. Someone looks like they had a rough week, we ask like how your week was. It doesn't mean that you have to go up to everyone and be like, if you're ever suicidal, like you can talk to me. Like that creates an uncomfortable position. But if you connect with someone on a deeper level and you get to know them as a human, you're gonna start to notice you're a safer space for them to talk to you. And using inclusive and respectful language. When we talk about mental health, when we talk about suicide, when we talk about discrimination, we're using it in a way to signal to people that we are a safe space, that there isn't a question, they're not wondering if you're safe, they're gonna know right away.
Speaking of respect, don't be shady. And I know that like a lot of people are like, what? I'll tell you. Sometimes in churches, people will do this little thing where they check in, like, oh, how are you doing? Or is there anything I can pray for? But your intention is not actually to be helpful. it's to have something to gossip about. And in this environment, we have to, you're not a confidential source, you're not maybe somebody's therapist, but the standard should be that you recognize the trust that somebody shared with you when they open up about this, and you make your best effort to protect that information that was shared in confidence. If you are struggling and you're like, I don't know what to do, that's kind of a little bit different. But if your intention in sharing something that has been shared with you is just to chat about it, then you need to check your heart, because that's not helpful. We also want to make sure that we are making it easy for people to get help. Like, taking that step to say, I want to do something different is hard. And if you haven't been there, or you haven't been on that journey with somebody, it's really, really hard when you're in the hole to decide to climb out of it. And so we want to do our best to help people, making sure that help is visible and accessible. We can know who is in our communities and make sure that we're aware of like what's going on, and who's available and who we can refer people to. We also want to lead by example. And so it's like fine to be like, yeah, I was talking to my therapist, blah, blah, blah. And just like normalizing a culture where we value mental health is really important.
Yeah, and partnering with the community, it's taking that next step to say, okay, we're talking about these things, let's make sure everyone has resources. So knowing where you can get support, where you can get help, and making sure that that's accessible. Even if all you can be is a supportive ear, and then say, okay, like here's resources I know about, that's a step that maybe other people don't have access to. And I know the thing that's most important to me when I'm with clients especially is like being open and honest and truthful about my intentions, which is I'm not here to do anything but to support you, and making sure that like very clearly they know what I'm about, why I'm there to support them, and what I'm going to do in terms of supporting them and the steps that looks like.
Okay, so I have debated talking about this in this format, but I'm going to. But it's a little tough. And anybody that knows like me and Emily and knows kind of like how she found me, I will say, knows I was not in a great place. I was like months away from becoming a psychologist and like doing all these things that everybody, on the outside looking in, it looked like I was like thriving. But I was struggling. And I kind of alluded to this, I think, when we did our Storyteller Sunday, that like we had this conversation. And I was like 1,000 miles away from my support system. My grandma had died, who was like my person, so I was grieving. I was really struggling with like myself. And somehow Emily and I like kind of fell into this conversation where I disclosed that like I was not really trying to be alive. I was unwell, and like not in the sense that I was like actively trying to kill myself, but I wasn't actively trying to protect myself either. And to even like share that with Emily was really scary for me because she was a therapist and like a mandated reporter and all these things. And I think it was truly a God moment where I was able to open up to her. And I don't even know if I've shared that with anybody. So sorry if you're watching and you didn't know, but like I was bad. I was in a bad place. And I think that Emily really like helped me through that season. There's this belief sometimes that if people really are like dead set on wanting to kill themselves, there's nothing you can do. But like I am here to tell you that that's not true because Emily stopped me.
I think it's, as a therapist, you get training about when someone like comes up to you, but like that's a client, that's someone you see like for 45 minutes once a week, not someone you genuinely care about. And so it's different when someone you love comes up to you and says like, hey, I'm like not protecting myself in the way that I normally would. Internally, you can panic. It is okay. It is okay to be a mess, but externally, we want to stay calm. That person coming to you is coming to you to be a source of stability and support. And if you genuinely can't be that, you need to be very clear about that with that person. But if you are able to do that, staying calm. I know when Essence told me about what was going on, like my first reaction, like I'm very much like a doer. I need to like I need to have a plan. I need to like, let's problem solve it. But the first step really was just to like stay calm and be able to be present. Because I knew if I went off into my head and I started to plan, okay, like what do we need to change? What support does she need? Then I wasn't gonna be able to listen to what she was saying. And so staying calm and being present becomes really important. If you get upset, they're gonna panic too.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that was so powerful to me is like I dumped all this stuff and she was like, "Can I hug you?" And I was like, "Yes, thank you." And it wasn't one of those things where like I had to like jump into planning with my friend, but I could just like be a mess. Was super helpful. I also think that something that's really important, again, is to ask directly. When you're worried about suicide and you say like, "Oh, you good?" They'll probably be like, "Yeah, I'm fine," or "Yeah, it's well," right? Like specific questions get specific answers. And so ask those specific questions. Ask like, is it getting better? Are you protecting yourself more? Are you choosing to like live life? Like those specific questions really like create the avenue where you can be honest, you can have the conversation, and there's no confusion on like, do they really want to know how I'm doing, or are they just saying that because they're supposed to?
And once you get an answer, validate and believe what they're telling you. It's not up to you to be like, they said this, but I don't really think they're gonna kill themselves. Like if they're telling you that, you need to believe them, believe their story. If they're telling you that they're gonna be safe, you can always fact check, but believe what they're telling you as being the honest answer. And if they're finding it difficult, just be like, okay, when you're ready, I'm here to listen. I know that was something that when we were talking about your story, there were parts that like I hadn't earned the ability to like get access to that information yet. And I didn't get upset. I didn't get mad. I said, whenever you're ready to talk about that part, like I'm here. And keeping that door open, make sure that you can continue to have conversations when they're ready to disclose more information.
I also think that when you're in a place like that, you're not wanting to like open up all of the wounds that you've ever had that led you to this spot. And I think that one of the biggest things, we were laughing about this when we were talking about it because it was so true. Emily was like, you were using me. But one of the things that kept me going back to Emily's apartment was that she always like made sure I was fed. Like I was not going to the grocery store. I wasn't doing anything. Like you could open there's nothing in there. And Emily was like, "I made you dinner. Here you go. Why don't we watch TV? Oh, I've been wanting to watch this show." And she would just let me nap and sleep and like be around Monty, our dog, and just like all this stuff. Like I wasn't ready to like unpack all of my trauma and the worst things that happened. But I was like, okay, yeah, I'll eat this food. Yeah, I'll pet the dog. And like before I knew it, things started to get better. And I think that the balance of not having my autonomy taken away and her just saying like, this is exactly what you have to do, but also her not being so far away that I felt like I had to like get out of the hole by myself was really helpful. So like that balance of like having options, but not like putting them on somebody, I think does a lot more than we realize or that we give credit for.
Yeah, and I think ultimately you just want to be honest and realistic with what's going on. It doesn't mean that you have to like not think about all of the things that could go wrong. I know a lot of us get anxious, and so we plan and try and manage, but be honest. Trust your gut, trust the information you're getting, and continue to observe. If someone discloses to you that they're thinking about suicide, and we're going to talk about the risks and how to judge risks, it doesn't mean you have to jump right into action, but it does mean you need to be present. And if you can be present, that gives you an opportunity to observe. And once you observe, then you can take those actionable steps. But it's so important just to be mindful and continue to stay in touch. You want to make sure that like if someone tells you what's going on with them, that you follow up, you check in. It doesn't mean you have to blow up their phone. It doesn't mean that you have to be calling all hours of the night. But it does mean that saying like, hey, I was thinking about you, how are you doing? Or let's grab lunch or come over this week or something like that, can just make sure that you have eyes on that person. And if somebody has eyes on them, that means that there's a level of safety and protective factors that come in there. I think one of the biggest things, especially with staying in touch, is that there's this myth that once someone has attempted suicide, their risk factors go down. But in reality, once you have attempted suicide once, your risk for attempting suicide again actually increases. And so staying in touch becomes incredibly important. Even if you think that they're fine, even if the attempt period is over, you want to continue to stay in touch because those risk factors increase.
I think the other thing too is that like it is a lot to be somebody's person during those times. Like I know that I've been depressed several times throughout the course of our relationship, and I just know I am undesirable. Like, it's just not a fun time. But I think that one of the things that happens is if we stop viewing our friends as friends and start viewing them as like responsibilities, then that is what will happen. But I think one of the best things is that Emily took the good and the bad. So if I was having a good day, we were having a good day. And we weren't talking about how I was depressed. We weren't talking about how I was sad. We were just doing life. And so I think that when you're supporting people, you don't only have to be that. It doesn't only have to be about their like bad mental health. It can be about, did you see this thing on TV? And I think reminding people that like there is a normal life outside of sadness also does a lot more than we give credit for. But it is important to know how worried you should be with different things. So we wanted to kind of lay out the risk. We do have a list of resources that we're going to share, and so I'm not gonna like go super in depth with these because you can see them. But what you really need to know is that the higher the risk, the more concerned we are. So at a lower end of we have, well, I guess I should explain. So there are two things, ideation and intent. And I think that these are important to separate. So if we have suicidal ideation, that means I'm thinking maybe passively, maybe actively. Like I'm having these thoughts that kind of go through my head about, well, what if I wasn't alive anymore? I wish I could just wake up in 20 years and I don't have to be awake today. That's kind of like you're having the thoughts of it, but you're not really coming up with a plan. Intent is, I'm gonna do it. I intend to like carry out this plan. And so ideation, a lot of people are so afraid in therapy, especially to disclose that they're like having thoughts of suicide because they think it means I'm gonna hospitalize them immediately. And we have to have so many conversations about like having suicidal ideation while a risk is not like the riskiest that you can be. And you can still kind of do life while having concerns about like, having these suicidal thoughts. We kind of move up. So in like a moderate range of things, we're worried because they've developed some type of a plan. Maybe there's no details on how they're going to carry that out, but there is a plan. So somebody's like, yeah, I would overdose, or I would shoot myself and I have a gun, or whatever they've thought about how they would do it is a kind of a sign for us, like maybe we should be more concerned. When we get into kind of the very high, the imminent, and the critical risk, and this is what we're going to talk about with like, when do you involve a professional? When do you maybe take away some autonomy-ish? Like, when do you really like involve the hospital? Is when people are either like, they have a plan, they have all the materials, they've put everything together, and they're about to carry it out, or they've already started carrying out. So somebody calls you and says like, I just took a bunch of pills. Or I'm standing here with this, I'm on a bridge and I'm like about to jump. Like those are things where being a little support kind of like, oh, I love you and I'm gonna check in with you in a week is not gonna cut it when the risk is so imminent.
So the thing that we talk to like our clients the most about is having open conversations about risk becomes incredibly important. My very first session with all my clients, I say, you will never leave session thinking everything is fine and have like the cops come knocking down your door to take you to the hospital. If you were that unsafe with you, you're gonna know about it. And so that's when being honest and very open about your intentions becomes very clear. Because while that person might have come to you and you thought you made a decision to keep them safe, you're risking damaging the relationship if you're not being very clear about risk. And
re-traumatizing people.
Right.
Like if I'm relaxing after my therapy session and now all of a sudden the cops are here to take me to the hospital,
right.
That is not the intention of what we were doing there.
Mm-hmm. And so making sure autonomy is very important, but there are some times where people might not recognize how unsafe they are or how much support that they may need, and that's when hospitalization comes into effect. Every state's a little bit different, but Florida has something called the Baker Act. And the Baker Act is an involuntary hospitalization for 72 hours that makes sure anyone who is at immediate risk for harming themselves or somebody else can be placed into psychiatric care to make sure that they are given medication and support with the plan of allowing them to then leave the hospital and seek therapy or whatever support systems they need. And so as professionals, you can you have someone come to therapy, they'll disclose, and you talk about Baker acting them or supporting them in some way, getting them to the hospital. If you are not a mandated reporter of some kind, if you're not, if you're just a person who is just in church and someone comes up and discloses to you, you don't have to initiate those steps. A professional will, but you can talk about calling 911 or taking someone to the emergency room. If you have a friend, family member who's at risk for harming themselves or somebody else, and they meet, we'll talk through some of these criteria, and you are
immediately concerned about their safety, call 911 or take them to the emergency room. Don't try. Oh, sorry. The immediate concern is not about not how you're feeling, because you might be like, oh my God, this is horrible. But if they are saying, look, I don't think I can be safe. I hear you and I want to, but I don't think that I don't trust myself, or I don't think that I can follow this plan, or I'm stopping taking my meds and I don't think I can. It's not about just because there is a risk, we should all freak out now, and now all of a sudden their autonomy is taken away. Mm-hmm. It is, and that is in some of our resources. We talk about the terminology is non-carceral approaches. So we want to give people as much freedom and as much choice and be very, very respectful in things. But if they are just demonstrating they're unwilling or unable to keep themselves safe, or there's psychotic features where they're having thoughts in their head, or they're hearing voices that are telling them to harm themselves or harm other people, they may just need a little bit more stability before they can kind of come back home. So these are also on our resources that we are giving, just so that you know, okay, what do I do, and when should I do that?
Yeah, I think it's just so important that because of those levels of suicidal ideation, that we don't immediately jump to hospitalization, that this is really our last step to making sure that somebody can be safe. And so we want to be really mindful of how and when we use this resource, and that this is an ultimate protectant, but also brings a lot of risk that comes with it because of how people can be treated within these scenarios, or it can be really traumatizing for the cops to come and take you to the hospital, because oftentimes that means you're handcuffed or you're not treated as well. And so we want to just be really mindful that we support people, get them what they need, but also make sure that if they are unable to keep themselves safe, that you are taking those steps to help keep them safe.
Yeah, so thank you all for hanging in there with us. This is, I know, a little bit on the longer end of things. We really just want to wrap up with this reminder that compassion without action is just observation. And so we have seen things, and we all live our lives, and we go through and we interact with different people, and our encouragement would be to pay attention. Watch the people around you, watch the people that you're doing life with, and if you see that they're struggling and you don't do anything, you're just observing. Compassion compels us to act. Compassion compels us to go ahead and get involved and be a part of somebody else's burdens and what they're struggling with. And so we want to do that. We also put together kind of a resource list. There's a QR code here, and we'll try to move out of the way.
Yeah, we'll get out. We'll leave this up.
Yeah.
But this has, everyone's grabbing their phones.
Yes.
I like this. So it has the FACTS acronym on there, so you can look for warning signs. It also talks about, I know we're in the way of the QR code. It also talks about the levels of risk, and so what Essence went through
and
with
KK will post the link as well.
And it'll get posted, perfect. And it also has some links to different resources. If there's an immediate risk, obviously calling 911 and making sure that you can get someone to safety.
Well,
but also
not 911, call 988.
Yeah.
988 is the universal mental health hotline, because if you call 911, they will send the police. In there are also resources that again are non-carceral approaches to mental health. So there are the Trans Lifeline, the Trevor Project. There's different organizations that have ways that you can communicate with them that do not involve the police. There's both on there. I would encourage you to look into 988 and make your own judgments on like what situations you think that would be useful. But we also have things in there about ways to not involve the police, because I know that, mixed bag. But we love you all, and we're really grateful that you are letting us talk to you about this topic. And if anybody has questions, then
you can turn
you
KK's
can ask
mic
them.
on for me, Dave. She's gonna use KK's. So because this is a little bit longer than a normal message, let's just do a couple of questions. Oh, it's Corey's mic? All right, Corey's mic. Let's do a couple of questions, maybe 2 questions, and then maybe we'll do this again and make some more time for Q&A too. But will you please give them a hand? Wasn't that wonderful? So before we go to the questions, for us, it's not enough just to say as a church we care about people's mental health. Like we want to, because if we presented this on another night with you all being as busy, or another morning with you all being as busy as we all are, we'd have 20 people here, which is great, but I want all of us to have this information because you never know who's going to need it. So that's why we're taking a Sunday morning, and it's not like a super exciting topic. It's very somber.
Kind of a bummer.
It's kind of a bummer, but understand that as a church, if we're serious about taking care of one another and being there for one another, we're going to have things like this from people that know what they're talking about, because it could save someone's life. And whereas you could have me up here making jokes for 45 minutes, and that's fun and wonderful, I hope, this is maybe more important than anything I could say on a Sunday morning. I really believe that. So thank you for hanging with us, and you guys did an incredible job. So I don't know what you were nervous about. Let's do a couple questions. I saw one in the back. Yeah, Michael. Here. I'll hold the mic for you. And we'll do one other question besides Michael.
Good morning. The Surgeon General had declared that there's a national emergency on loneliness. So, of course, that would lead to, I think, thoughts of suicide. Are you seeing statistics on age-related suicide thoughts, like the younger generation below 50 is experiencing more than the generation above 50?
There are like age-related differences in suicide. There's a lot of like differences in risk that we didn't break down a part of this, but like that are out there. If I remember this correctly, it looks kind of like an upside down U. And so kind of at the younger, less frontal lobe development, angsty, like teenager years, it's higher. In the middle of life, it kind of like drops a little bit. And so it's people that are parents or whatever, we see rates go down a little bit. But then in older adulthood, they go back up, and the rates are higher again. There is a resource on there that I put, I think it's called SAGE. It's for queer older adults that talk about resources specifically for suicide prevention in that demographic, because the needs are different than maybe a teenager. We also included things for parents on how to, like if your child is expressing suicidal ideation or has engaged in an attempt or whatever, that's from Nationwide Children's Hospital. And so if you are like on either end, there's resources for parents, there's resources for teens, and there also is for that age group, because yes, the risk does go up.
We also know that COVID drastically changed the statistics, especially when it came to like the alienation, loneliness, and hopelessness, that it actually increased suicide rates for every age group. That is still something that we're continuing to deal with too. So COVID changed a lot of the numbers as well.
All right, one more question. Who else? Another question? Yes. You usually have good questions. No pressure.
Actually, because there was no other question, I took an opportunity. I just want to say you girls acted like you've done this forever, like you're professionals. There was no hesitation. You were wonderful. This was probably one of the most informative, necessary Sunday mornings that I've attended, and I truly appreciate all the work you put into it and the way you presented it with so much compassion and information.
Yeah, it's good.
Thank you.
Awesome. Come on, let's stand on our feet and give them a hand. Will you do that for me? So good. Awesome. We're going to just pray together before we leave. Thank you again. We really appreciate it. It was really good. I'm just like I know I don't want to sound patronizing, but I'm just so freaking proud of you guys. I really am. I'm so proud of what you're doing and what your heart is, because there's a lot of ways outside of what you've decided to do to use your degree to make a lot more money quicker. And you guys have chosen to take your degree and all the years of schooling and to get down in the trenches, really, and to help people. And we're just believing for blessing after blessing for both of you, because you've definitely blessed us today. Yeah. Let's pray together. Lord, we just thank you for today and this information that is life-saving, life-giving. And we just thank you. You are so good to us, and we want to be an extension of your love, your acceptance, your patience, your grace, your goodness, your hopefulness for those around us. And I pray for anyone today that's here in this room that might have some sort of suicidal ideation, or maybe they have begun to put plans into action. I'm just praying that they know that they are safe here and that they can reach out, they can talk to somebody, that they can find somebody here that they maybe have made a connection with, and they can begin to open up. Because I believe that you want us to live and not perish. You want us to thrive. You want us to live a life that you intended us to live, that your plans for each one of us are beyond our wildest imaginations. And I just ask that hope fill hearts today. Maybe people that are watching online or watching this later, that they'll feel hope and that they'll feel comfortable finding someone they trust to talk to. And we just thank you today. And we ask that you bless us, make this week be a great, productive, wonderful week for everyone that is here. And we just thank you today. In your name we pray, and everyone says, amen. All right, we love you guys. Thank you so much. And we'll see you next week.